You're watching The Experience, Comic Culture and Sales. Streaming live daily to Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter.
2, 1.
What's up, the internet? It's producer Kyle. How's it going? Since you've seen me last on this program, a lot of stuff has happened. I've driven roughly 2,000 miles in, 2 weeks. I've been the stage manager of a very successful festival. I executive produced that same very successful festival. I have eaten at Sheetz 6 times. If you don't know Sheetz, you're wrong. If you prefer Buc-ee's, you're wrong. I will give you Wawa. Okay. Now, I've also celebrated a 3-year-old's birthday and appeared on a professional wrestling program. Plus, I'm almost dug out from under the pile of work from my vacation. Why am I telling you all of this? One, I'm still sore from Publix doesn't count Richard Ship. All right. I will give you a Nando's peri peri sauce. But that's it. Okay. The reason I'm telling you all this is because I do not know what is happening in the comic world except for investigating who pooped at New York Comic Con. We've gotten to the bottom of that. So, we'll get into that during the show, but I'm telling you that because I don't know what's happening in the world. So rather than try and be topical this week, we're going to answer your questions from the mailbag. I hope none of them are weird. This is Devil's Advocates. All right.
So before we get underway, I have to ask, do you have an alibi for Saturday afternoon in New York City Comic Con? Okay.
Yes, I was in Columbus, Ohio at a 3-year-old's birthday party.
Okay, that's a perfect cover. All right, I like it.
But I do know the answer to the question.
Yeah, I think I know the answer as well, or at least the answer that's being reported.
Which was?
That it was apparently a service animal.
It was. But the more fun answer is the joke going around the comic book industry that Rich Johnston pooped on the floor at New York Comic Con and reported on it so he would have something to write about.
I mean, that's also a plausible theory. And then he could have circulated the dog rumor just to throw off the scent, right?
It's true. Also, anyone who's ever been to New York Comic Con and stood at the lines for the bathroom recognizes it really could have just been anything.
Yeah.
Like, those lines are sometimes longer than the lines to meet the celebrities. 2 years ago when I was there, the line to the bathroom was so long, it took me less long to walk from the convention center 4 blocks back to my hotel, do what I needed to do, walk the 4 blocks back, and my friends were still in line.
Oof.
Yeah.
I've got a safe alibi. I was over here on the West Coast.
Ron's was on the whole wrong side. For all we know, it was you, Ship.
Yeah.
I mean, you're closest.
Unless I learned how to teleport, I'm safe.
So yeah, we were talking, and Bronze has another show after this, and I've been out of the loop for the last couple weeks, getting caught up and having Poe Fest and all this other stuff that I've been doing, and so figured rather than jump in on any one particular topic, we should get to some of the questions that you guys in the comments and around the internet have been asking us. And
Absolutely.
What we're calling the first ever Devil's Advocate viewer mailbag, because I couldn't come up with a catchier title.
At least it's accurate.
It is.
So yeah, we've taken the questions that you guys have submitted on the form on our website for us to cover, and we're going to some of them. Honestly, like if we tried to tease it out into a full hour conversation, may not be the best use of our time, I think.
Right. At some point, we would have to be debating like where decimal places come from and the etymology of fractional numbering. And nobody needs us to go into what the Romans or whoever the hell invented that were thinking.
Exactly. So we have a few of those questions that we've been meaning to get to ready to go. We're going to kind of discuss them in a little bit more of a short form, round robin kind of way. We're also willing to accept new questions from the chat. If you guys got anything you want to bring in, doesn't mean we won't necessarily retouch on some of these on a later show if new evidence comes to light or something like that. But I think it's a good way to get some of those questions answered. And just by the way, thanks everybody for submitting those questions. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's Nerd Killer. It's one word, NERDCULAR ship.
Oh, that'd be fun. I watched part of one that happened on the Batman Day, the Lost Batman Day stream.
Lost Batman Day stream reappearing starting Wednesday.
Ooh, that's exciting.
Yeah. It's a whole thing. The reason we don't use your spelling ship is because that second word gets censored on most platforms.
Ah, that's a good reason.
Yeah. So, should we get to our first question?
Sure. So
the first question I'm going to start is,
okay.
How many lows could Rob Lowe rob if Rob Lowe could rob lows?
I have one point of order. Can Rob Lowe get low?
He can get low, which is actually the number of children plus his wife that exist.
He could probably do, I want to say 7 lows.
Have you ever seen the Low Files, the TV show?
No, I have not. The Low Files.
Yes, it's a reality show with him and his 2 sons where they go check out like haunted spots and they go searching for Bigfoot and all these kind of exploring urban legends. But at one point, Rob Lowe thinks, I'm Rob Lowe. I could probably talk my way onto Area 51. And he walks in the front door of Area 51, and the cameras are like a mile away, zoomed in, and you just see him very quickly exit. You remember me from TV? Can I?
But okay, now here's the best part about that, though. Imagine being, you're in the military, you're on post, your watches the guardhouse or whatever at Area 51. And Rob Lowe walks in.
Right. I think that was his plan, is just to be like, holy crap, that's Rob Lowe, and just take them all aback.
It almost worked.
Yeah, almost.
I bet you if it was like Christopher Walken or something, they would have let him in.
Well, then he could just walk in.
Exactly. You got it.
All right, you start with the actual real questions.
Okay, so the first one that came up, we're kind of going in chronological order here. I wish I had who asked which question here now, but I don't. I apologize in advance. Somebody in one of our chats asked, what was the difference between a 9.8, a 9.9, and a 10 when it comes to comic book grading? And this is a wonderful question. I think that it comes up probably most frequently because people see 9.9s and 10s and get a little squirrely about it. Like, what's the difference about that book versus this other book? It's also maybe sometimes a little hard to see the difference, especially once books are encapsulated. If you don't know what we're talking about, a lot of people know about like a CGC or a CBCS or any grading company has a 9.8 grade, for example. That's one you probably hear about the most. And it's basically I guess you could call it like an A. That's like an A grade when it comes to, if you're going to compare it to like educational grades. Well, there's also an A+. And that would be your 9.9. And there's also an A++, and that's a 10, which is gem mint / mint. And so the idea of a 10, this is the easiest way to explain it in my opinion, is to think of a 10 as being essentially perfect. There's no error that can be detected on the book whatsoever. And I think what people conflate is the idea that a 9.8 is supposed to be perfect. And a 9.8 is not perfect on the grading scale. That's not what it's supposed to be. A 9.8 is something that can actually have a couple perfections, and a couple imperfections, I mean. And a 9.9 is just kind of in between that, where it might have one tiny error. And this is something that really gets people riled up, because you'll see books get at 9.9 or a 10 and they kind of freak out about it. I think it's worth pointing out one reason why that happens is because not all books are printed the same. That's a huge part of it. If you look at a lot of 9.9s and 10s that are out there on the market, they're not printed by one of the big two and one of their weekly books that come out. Usually there are definitely those out there, but the majority of times it's somebody it's a smaller printer that's a more specialty. They're using higher quality cardstock. They're using metal, or they're using a different type of material for the cover. They're probably taking a little bit more quality control into their printing process, and they're able to kind of focus on the quality of the batch a little bit more often. Those are some of the factors that play into that. Kyle, what do you think the difference between a 9.8, 9.9, and a 10 are?
If your grader has had their coffee this morning.
Okay, so you fall into that camp.
No, not really. There
Okay.
are certainly incremental and noticeable differences. However, the difference between a 9.8 and a 10, I'm going to leave 9.9s out, because below 9.8 it only goes by twos. You don't get a 9.7. They don't exist.
Well, until you get to 1.8.
Right, until you get to down towards a no grade, right?
Yeah,
like
yeah.
So between a 9.8 and a 10 is so minimal most of the time that it really does come down to some subjectivity. Now, when I say subjectivity, is that on the back a scuff, or is that a mark that was created when we took it out of the bag and board? Is that corner actually dinged, or is that a common print defect? Is Batman Schlong actually viewable or not? That was a thing with Batman Damned #1s, because there were tens of that. And some of them, when you looked at the book, some of the ones that got 9.8s, that particular panel was a little darker because the ink laid different. They're like, we're talking about minuscule differences when we're talking about this fine of a difference. And so sometimes it really does come down to, did your grader clean their glasses today? Is the magnifying glass perfectly clean? Is your grader having a good day or a bad day? Did his wife yell at him this morning? Like, it really does come down to, there aren't measurable differences necessarily. They become subjective differences at that high level. When you go from a 9.8 to a 9.6, it becomes much more measurable. And again, the difference between a 9.8 and a 10 is measurable. But from a 9.8 to a 9.9 and a 9.9 to a 10, it really is very... It's the difference between, is Bronze's beard black with a little bit of gray, salt and pepper, or gray but primarily black? Like, the definition really becomes in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about those three grades, I like to say it's distinction without a difference. Now, again, when we're talking about the difference between a 9 and a 9.8, now we can start to look at things like spine ticks and pressing defects and, staple wear and things like this that are actually... I like Keith's answer. Yes, I'm going to go with distinguished. But I got a beard story if we want to talk about it a little bit later. But
sure.
When we talk about Jay, don't start writing checks your body can't cash, my friend. But when we talk about those super high grades, it really is just the tiniest little things are the difference between a 9.8 and a 10. I like to more often compare a 8.8 and a 9.8, or an 8.5 and a 9.8.
I was kind of wondering where you were going with that, but I got you.
Right, but the difference between it, because now we're talking about a full grade, right?
Yeah.
And it's what's allowable at an 8.5 to a 9.8. right? And the difference is there because it's easier to talk about. Okay, at an 8.5, you've got some definitive color break on the spine. You've got some staple stress. You've got some spine wear. You might have some corners that are crumpled. You might have some page discoloration. You might have some bleed through. You might have some printer bleed that makes it onto the back cover. You might have discoloration. You might have, hell, I've seen 8s with stuff cut out of the book. So at that highest level, we're distinction without a difference. And as we start to break it down, it becomes much easier to quantify the differences.
Okay, so I want to jump in there with a couple things that I think can also contribute to this problem. And I think that they're very, whenever you talk about grading, there are things that sometimes get left out of the conversation. The first is you have to talk about the grading scale in general, because CGC is probably the most used grading scale at this point. However, CGC's grading scale is not the same as other grading scales. All grading scales essentially go back to Overstreet Price Guide and the Overstreet grading. Now, what's interesting about that is that the different takes on that have been modified over the years. So if you look at CGC grading, yeah, it has its roots in the Overstreet grading process, but it doesn't actually correlate 1-to-1. And CBCS is a little bit different as well. The real funny part about that is that Steve Borok is involved in kind of just about every level of that too at some point, which is really funny. But each company had its own take on it. And so when you're talking about cross grading, or you're talking about, well, I've had experience grading and I grade this way. The people that grade by the Overstreet Price Guide in a pure grading fashion, they actually have their own book on it, by the way, the Overstreet Guide to Grading, which is an interesting read. If you ever never checked it out, I highly recommend it, because I think it's probably one of the more comprehensive grading guides out there. But if you compare that to like what CGC grades on, they have a different standard. So that's one factor that's very different. Another factor that's different is I think that there's a huge gray area in terms of which grader grades your book, because I guarantee you that there are graders at CGC that are probably never handing out 10s, or very rarely, and graders that are handing out 10s, it's on a spectrum, right? More frequently. I don't want to say all the time, but more frequently. And you might have a grader that just kind of gets in that habit of being like, well, this is a 9.8, this is a 9.8, this is a 9.8. And then maybe if a book strikes their fancy and they kind of look at it, they're like, man, this is even a little bit better than a 9.8. Maybe they say it's a 9.9 or a 10. Listening to people from CGC talk, like Matt Nelson talk, the average book is under a grader's eyes for about 30 seconds. Now, that doesn't mean that that's the most. That's an average. A modern book, and think about it, they're grading a lot of modern books these days, takes a lot less time to grade than a vintage book. So you start looking at a vintage book, it's probably going to be a little bit longer. If you're looking at an X-Men 1 from 1963, almost always, I'm guessing that's going to take several minutes. Plus, they have other people at CGC take a look at it as well, apparently, which I don't know if that's always true, but that's what they say.
So when I first started dealing with CGC, and I know this to be true, when you were sending in a vintage, so you're sending in, and we'll just deal with the actual eras, right? If you were sending in gold or silver, and this was, by the way, this was before CBCS existed.
Yeah.
2 graders would look at your book. They would grade them independently, and then the grade you got was the average. When you were sending in something more modern, that wasn't always the case.
Yeah.
That's why those older tiers cost so much more initially. As the years went on, the numbers kind of came closer together. And their current pricing structure kind of reflects that they're spending more time on the moderns than they used to, and less time on the older stuff than they used to. I think probably because experience and company growth. And Reef, you might have been involved before even I was, or I know CBCS was 3 at one point. Like I said, it's all changed as their policies and practices have changed.
Yeah.
So
When you mentioned CBCS, that's an important point I want to get to. This may have changed, and this just came up on my Discord not that long ago. On my Discord server, there was a conversation about this, and it reminded me CBCS had a policy where if a grader came in and said that's a 10, and they have less graders in CGC, but every grader would then go and take a look at that book and decide, okay, do we still think this is a 10? It's almost like a like an error on the production line, and all the experts come in and they like kind of take a look at it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So and I don't think that's CGC's policy, for example. So there's going to be some differences there. So CBCS, it might be harder to get a 10 because if that's still the way it works, which I think it is, you have more scrutiny being applied upon it, most likely. So a lot of double checks happening. So the theory there, which by the way is sound, we don't want to hand out a 10 willy-nilly.
Right.
Which makes sense.
So the equivalent that I use in my everyday life, right, is actually barbecue. When you compete in barbecue, your barbecue gets graded on a scale of 1 to 9 across 3 categories: taste, tenderness, and appearance. You have judges who straight up will tell you, unless it's the best barbecue I've ever eaten, I'm not giving you a 9. You have other judges that go, if this barbecue is good, if I would serve it to my family, it's a 9. At the same time, they tell people not to give less than a 6 or a 7 unless it's inedible. Because if you put it on the plate and it's edible, it checks enough of the boxes to at least rate a 6. Right? Even if it sucks.
I hate those scales.
Well, a 1 is you turned it in, but it's raw or unedible. And then it's categories up from there to get to a 6, right?
I get that, but to me, it's like if it's only like, and especially in that scale, it only goes to 9. It doesn't go to 10. If it's below a 6 or a 7, it probably shouldn't have been judged at all, that kind of thing. So really, you're talking about such a narrow band of grading.
Than that, but that's the simplistic version because
fair enough.
Those scores is weighted based on the different thing, and you get very distinct, very different numbers.
Yeah.
So, like I said, but it's an easy way to, So
yeah, I want to address this real fast.
Yes.
Yeah. So is Overstreet the one when people say fine to very fine or very fine near mint? Yeah. In fact, it's worth it if after the show or whatever, if you want to go look at, you can just search Overstreet's grading definitions and you can get that list. And by the way, CGC will even on their scale show you what the equivalent grade is to the kind of the letter grade system, if you will, the VF plus, that kind of stuff. Yes, that's the original grading system. That's why it's kind of more universally used than somebody saying like, this is a 9.2. They're not necessarily going to say that often, although it's kind of changing. It's becoming more common for me to see people refer to like a raw book by its number grade equivalent than by a letter grade equivalent. But that's kind of the OG method, if you will.
Right. And so I'll give you another little piece of insight here, Sean. The reason we tell people here in the experience to use fine to very fine or very fine near mint, good, those grades, especially here on the air, is because grading is so subjective. If I sell you a raw book and I say, I think this is a 9.8 and you get it and you don't, now we have a problem. Whereas if I say, I think this is very fine or good, it leaves a little more wiggle room for graders, for sellers, and for people to kind of negotiate based on that, right? The number grading really is a way to simplify the commerce of comics. Because if I tell you I have a 9.8 of this book, and it's graded and it's a 9.8, all we can do at this point is negotiate price. You can't question the quality, same as I can't question the quality, because it's graded, it's encapsulated. Whereas if I say it's very fine and you look at it and say, actually, I don't think it's very fine, I think it's just fine, now we can have a little bit back and forth, right? And so
that's interesting, though, because I mean, really, if you say it's very fine, you're saying it's an 8.0.
Right.
But I mean, you're not giving a range that way.
But what I'm saying is that if I think it's a very fine and you think it's a fine, there's some wiggle room there. A very fine could be anywhere from an 8.0 to a 9, according to, what grading scale you're using.
Right. So you're saying because the term is contained within those number grades, that's the range. Okay,
I tell you it's a 9 and it's an 8, you're pissed at me.
Yeah.
So that's the other way that those terms are used, right? Is it's an old school way to grade rather than saying it's a number that leaves some wiggle room for human error or human differentiation. I sold a friend of mine a New Mutants 98 that in my look was probably a 9.2, 9.4. I told him to have it pressed before he had it graded. He didn't, and he got an 8.0. He was pissed at me, and I go, dude, I told you I thought it was this, but to have it pressed, and you didn't. So now we're having this sort of, this is why number grades are sort of troublesome when you're doing the commerce of comics if they aren't graded. So.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of the commerce of comics, I'll give you one example that's really, for sellers, I think this is a good thing to hear. A really common place to buy comic books. It's one of the larger online shops in the world and a physical shop too, of course. My Comic Shop. My Comic Shop provides grades for all their books when you go to buy them. Those grades are always one grade lower than what they have actually determined that book will be. They intentionally drop the grade 1 grade level because of a couple different reasons. One is that they want to never overpromise and underdeliver. They'd rather underpromise and overdeliver. Another is grading is subjective. Another is they're probably about to ship you that book, so it's always a possibility that some damage could occur in shipping, most likely. So that's a really interesting point. When it comes to those kinds of things, I think that grading is subjective, but it's also something that it really shouldn't be as subjective as it is. And this gets to the other point that I wanted to make, which is that I often see people post something, there's kind of like all these places where people grade their comics, that kind of thing, like grade my comic, what's my grade, that kind of stuff. There's one on the official CGC forum, and people will post something and they'll be like, or they get a book back and they'll be like, I don't get it. This was a 9.8. I had this pre-screened at a 9.8 and it came back a 9.4. And you look at the book and like, I'm sorry, that's not a 9.8 in my eyes. Like, I'm looking at it and I'm thinking like, okay, this corner is blunted. There's this little spine tick here that definitely should have been marked down. People overgrade their own books for a couple different reasons: inexperience, and they want a higher grade. So they start to look at it through, I call them 9.8 goggles. And they start to kind of look at things as if it should be a 9.8 when it's not necessarily the case. You have to look at each book and really start to be critical of it. And my advice would be to be harsher rather than more forgiving in your grade estimates if you want to avoid that kind of disappointment.
Right. One of my favorites is when people would come in and say, "Oh, this was my favorite book as a kid. It's got to be a 9.8." I'm like, "Bro, you read the crap out of this. It's a 5." And they get the 9.8 goggles. Like, I love that term. I'm going to steal it, by the way. And
sure, yeah.
They use their nostalgia or what they remember about the book to grade the book and not actually looking at the book.
Yeah, 100%. And by the way, it's possible. This is a story I love to tell. When I first started getting into the YouTube comic thing, one of the reasons that I did is because I want to start grading some of my books, and it was a new thing for me. And I wanted to do it for my own personal reasons. Most of them I want to pass on to my kid someday. And I didn't want, if she doesn't want a copy of G.I. Joe #1, I want her to at least be able to sell it and not get ripped off as much as possible by having like a grade to back it up a little bit. Instead of being like, here's a book, I don't know what it's worth. Well, that G.I. Joe #1 in that example is my childhood copy. I've had it since I was about, I think, 8 or 9 years old. Read it several times, and I took really good care of my comic books. It ended up grading at a 9.6. which I think is pretty impressive for an 8-year-old, an 8-year-old's comic who's now 30 years down the road, 35 years down the road, trying to submit that thing. So it is possible. You shouldn't assume that your books are in bad condition just because you read them. But if you're careful when you're reading your comic books, you can take better care of them. But you can't just assume that just because you've had it for 30 years and it's been in a bag and a board that it's perfectly fine. Or, it's probably perfectly fine, but that it's high grade.
Right. I think we probably could have talked about this topic for an hour, by the way.
We probably could have that. Yeah, I didn't realize it was going to have this much meat to it.
Right. So something that was brought up is this. So some of the ways this happens, and it doesn't always happen this way, is Bronze has talked about with some scammers and some other things. When these people offer guaranteed 9.6 or higher, 9.8 or higher, whatever, often what they're doing, especially if they're selling them graded, is they're sending 100 copies in and having them, what's the word I'm looking for? Pre-screened. So if they don't grade out that high, they don't grade them. And that's a risk that that some dealers are willing to take.
Yeah.
Because they know they could sell a 9.8 for a certain price and it will cover whatever their loss is on the book they can't sell. So it's a sketchy thing sometimes, but it's a way that a company like Dynamic Forces is sending in so many copies of a book. They might be sending 200 copies of a book in because they've pre-screened for only the super nicest ones. Then they're having CGC screen them. Then they're only grading the 9.8s or higher.
Yeah.
So
and it's weird.
It's economies of scale. It's a business move that isn't available to everybody.
Yeah.
But it can be very nice when it is.
One, it's a weird thing too, because, for example, I can't talk about the specifics, but I'm aware of a store exclusive right now that it was a Marvel book. So they had to order, 3,000 copies of it. And it's a much, 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 much smaller advertised print run. The extra copies are to be destroyed. And they're having a hard time getting a 9.8 on the number of copies that they had pre-sold for 9.8. For whatever reason, and these are, I've seen some of these books, to me, they look perfectly fine. But for some reason, every time they send them to CGC, they're getting rejected as a 9.8. And we're talking like, you had access to thousands of copies. You're picking out the best ones. You're sending them in over and over again. CGC is seeing something on those books that neither the person submitting nor I can see that is somehow kicking them out.
Well, and that's where that knowledge of the printing comes in.
Yeah.
And you've got to be able to say, hey, you're knocking this for this reason. You do know this is a listed manufacturer defect, right? It's a common error.
Yeah.
So it doesn't actually affect the grade.
Right.
Right. Like, so there's some of that again, when you're playing this game, we're talking about things that the average consumer can't touch.
I wanted to highlight this because this kind of goes along with that idea. It's an example of that topic. Reef the Sea Forever says a good example of that is Luke Cage number 198 that has off-centered cover that sold for $46K on Heritage. For me, that's not a 9.8 with an off-centered cover. So centering isn't really a huge thing in comic books, especially if you're talking about, say, a Bronze Age comic book. Off-center Bronze Age cover, it was miswraps, whatever you're looking at there. A lot of Uncanny X-Men books, the uncanny word is near the top of the cover, and then on some it's more properly. Yeah, exactly. And that's not really what matters. Now, if you're looking at like sports cards, centering is probably one of the most important factors there is in the grading of a sports card. So you could make an argument that it should be more important, but as it's kind of taken into account right now, it's not. Another one this reminds me of, and this is kind of a weird example because it's the opposite, where it's something they don't care about, and they don't care about it regardless of what's going on with that print run. But on some books, there might be something called like bindery tears, right? Little little tear marks at the top and the bottom of the spine of the cover. It happens especially with like 48-page glossy cover books.
And square bounds.
Yes, and very, very often with square bounds. And if every copy that CGC, for example, sees of that book has that condition, it's like what Kyle's talking about. They're not going to grade against it because they know every copy has that defect from the printer.
Something else that's important here is where it's sold.
Yeah.
Right? It's sold at Heritage. So the thing about it is that it's not selling in a, how do I put this? The buyer is probably someone like myself who collects mistakes. I collect errors.
We need to read this follow-up because this is very germane to what we're talking about right now. Going back to the Heritage auction, the other 9.8 Luke Cage sold for $124K, and as a perfectly centered cover at this price point, it would be important. So that's right. The other thing, and not to cut Kyle off here, but that's the other thing that's important about this is they both might be a CGC 9.8 in the CGC's eyes, but that doesn't mean the market's going to treat it the same. Some people are going to want a more perfectly centered book. Some people are going to want a book that might be kind of more of an oddity too. That's possible.
Right. Collecting. So one of the things I like to do is collect miscuts and error covers and things like that. And that has a value that I'm willing to pay because of that. So when we're looking at sold listings specifically, you can't know who bought it. Unless you know who bought it and why they bought it, the speculation as to why would they pay that much for something like this is just that. It's pure speculation.
Yeah.
Why would Dinesh from Bad Idea spend all that money on the first appearance of Miles Morales cover original art? Well, because to him and to a certain segment of the market, it's worth what he paid. I don't necessarily see it as being worth that much because it's more money than I'll likely ever have in my entire life. So I need to devalue it to make myself feel good. But to him, it has this value, right? And to the market, it has a certain value. And so when we're talking about sold listings, that's an important thing to remember.
Yeah.
Is that everybody buys for their own reasons and everybody's willing to look at certain things through their own lens. I have a G.I. Joe that Bronze would probably never want because the cover is so badly misstapled. You can't even tell it's a G.I. Joe book unless you look at like the third page.
Oh, there's some truly great ones of those that are like the staples are like 3 or 4 inches over from the spine.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
Is their first staple goes through the first 2 pages right through the middle of the cover. And it came from the factory that way. Now I have it because I think that's hysterical. And I want it in my collection. But a G.I. Joe collector, it's garbage. So it's why it's, this idea of why you buy too is important. Yeah. So do you want to keep playing? Do we want to keep playing in this sandbox or do we want to move on?
You know what? We talked about this being potentially a bit of a shorter show. I say we kind of just stay in this sandbox and we save some of these other questions for a future episode.
Sounds like a plan to me.
All right.
There was one of the questions that I had a good answer for just because I'm going through it, but we'll save that. Maybe we'll do that next week.
Okay. Sounds good. Yeah. Then we have a topic for next week ready to go, which I like. Yeah. And just when it comes to the topic of grading being subjective, we come to the topic of buyers having their subjective opinions as well. The other thing that plays into this too is kind of the arbitrariness. I don't know what the right word would be there. The arbitrary nature of those 3 grades anyway. Who decided that a 9.8 mattered any more than a 9.6 or a 9.9? A 9.9, obviously people are going to care more about a 9.9 than a 9.8. But what I mean is it's just the grade that falls between those 2 grades. Yet there's this huge emphasis on 9.8s as if it's become kind of some gold standard. And again, that primarily only applies to modern books. If you're talking about a golden age or a silver age book, I mean, yeah, it's fantastic. Most likely, if you pull a 9.8, you're going to be extremely happy. And it's very rare. But obviously, that's not the standard for an Amazing Fantasy 15 or an Action Comics #1, not even by a long shot. But when it comes to moderns, we say, oh, well, if it's not a 9.8, if it's a 9.6, it's practically worthless. I did 2 pre-screen orders with CGC my entire life. The first one was a 9.8 pre-screen. The second one was a 9.6 pre-screen, and people thought I was weird. And I did it on purpose because I said, okay, any book I'm submitting, as long as it's a 9.6, I want it encapsulated. Also, CGC has raised their prices to the point where if a reject fee costs a certain amount of money to where like, hey, if it got rejected for like $10 more, I could have just got it encapsulated. And again, for these books, I said, 9.6 is perfectly fine. I'm going to be okay with that because these aren't modern ratios or whatever that people are going to freak out if it's a 9.6. Like people think a first appearance of Carnage in a 9.6 is still pretty cool. That kind of thing. And I think that's a huge part of this as well, is that people have this focus on 9.8 so much. And then they get so pissed off when they're like, what is it? What even is a 10? Yep. And that by the way, that's when I said I've only done 2, that's the reason why, Reef.
Yeah, I'm the same way. If I'm sending a book in, it's one of 2 reasons. I'm sending it. 1, because not sending it in means the book is going to fall apart. I'm sending it in to preserve the book. Or 2, because the book has some sort of sentimental value to me, and I do not care about the grade. Right? I'm doing it because, for instance, every one of my Spider-Man books under 10 is graded.
Yeah.
That's a preservation thing. But I have a big run from like 310 to 375 where most of them are graded, because that was about the time I started having to go to the comic book shop with my dad to buy the Spider-Man comics. So the sentimentality of those books are important to me. I don't care what they're graded. They're never going to be for sale again.
Yeah.
Like, I don't care if my nephew doesn't want them when I'm dead. They're never going to be for sale again. So it didn't matter what the grade was. Now, there is an added level to this that we haven't touched on yet. And that's the thing that CBCS brought to the table that threw a big loop into my world when it happened, and I've since come to love, and that's the little check mark next to the grade. The presents as grade.
Yep.
So one of the things that isn't often considered, because so many people have a brand loyalty to CGC or perceive CGC to be so much better than everybody else, is that CBCS has actually created a number of mechanisms for more finely slicing the world, which is a concept I just learned about from Neil deGrasse Tyson, right? Where you take a group set of data and you slice it more and more finely so that you know exactly what your data is telling you.
Makes sense.
You start off with a big group, and then you make it smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. He equates it to weight classes in wrestling. You start off with everybody wrestles anybody, and then you realize that that's not fair, so you break it down by weight, right? Yeah. And it becomes more and more fair. So what CBCS did is they made this check mark, which is, okay, your book might really only be a 5, but it's a 5 because you're missing 2 pages on the inside that once it's graded, you'll never know. So the check mark says, oh, well, it presents as a 9.8, but it's actually a 5. So when you look at it, it looks like a 9.8, but it's not. And what that does is it's for the person who's just trying to preserve a book, or for the person who's just trying to have a book in some sort of presentation methodology of a grade. Okay, great. This book looks better than it is. And I think it's important to talk about some of the other things that CBCS has brought to the table in terms of, signature authentication and other things that CGC just doesn't do or hasn't done.
Yeah.
Whether they're doing it now or not, I don't use CGC anymore, so I don't care. But
they're not.
Right. And they probably won't because they don't feel like they have to. But things like signature authentication, things like poster size and other things that CBCS has brought to the table has changed the information available with grades. And so knowing the difference between the two is a huge importance. So a CGC 9.8 and a CBCS 9.8 are not created equal, especially when the CBCS 9.8 has the check mark, or especially when the CBCS 9.8 is a pink slab and it's signature authentication, or whatever else. Knowing the differences between what the companies can do and will do is a huge level of understanding exactly what you're buying when you're buying it.
Yeah. Also, I mean, it's kind of weird. Not really germane to this conversation, but I have to bring it up. It kind of goes along with what Reef's saying here. CBCS is really trying, which, by the way, I sort of agree and disagree, but they definitely are trying one thing that just happened too, even though it's actually been out there for a while. It's just caught on that they're switching up their labels, which were a major complaint that people had about CBCS, which is kind of this funny thing to complain about, especially when I think Reef was the one that said it earlier. At the end of the day, don't look at the number at the top left, look at the actual book front and back cover, which is a very detailed way of saying something that's commonly said in the comic book community right now, which is buy the book, not the grade. And, that means something specific, but it also is funny because we're supposed to be focusing on the book. We should be focusing on the book. And yet people like to look at the little piece of paper that's in the top of the case. Now, if you're displaying your books, I've got slabs on display back here and other places. I do get it. There is an aesthetic to each company, and some people prefer the muted CBCS look. Some people prefer the more saturated CGC look. And that's a personal preference. I can't tell people what they like or don't like, but they did just change up their labels. It's worth looking into if you guys want to check it out. And it does concern specifically the 9.9 and the 10, which now have differentiation in the way that the 9.9 and 10 are colored compared to the 9.8 and below grades. So it is interesting that the CBCS is trying some stuff. And I will honestly say that I think their actual physical slab is hands down better than CGC's.
Yep. So I don't frame a lot of my slabs, but when I do, I actually undermat and overmat, so you can't actually see the slips.
There you go.
Like I don't have any need to see that information. I want to see the cover.
Yeah.
So when in my frames, you can't see it. And it doesn't matter what the little slip of paper looks like. It's what the cover looks like.
Yeah.
And so I think that's an important thing to remember. So
yeah. Yeah, you're saying he likes the gold 9.9 CBCS labels. I think the 10 is like a
it's like
platinum
a diamond
or something. Yeah, or something. Yeah, it's
I don't love it. I think it's a good idea. I think it's a fun idea. If you have the choice between getting them or not getting them, I would choose not to get them personally. Like I would be like, can you just make it look the regular and put the number on it and be done? But
it goes back to the whole card
I also
grading
don't
thing.
like when CGC does the little cartoons on one side, like the Todd McFarlane signature series, and it's got a bunch of McFarlane bullshit.
Custom labels.
Yeah, I don't love that.
I mean, again, that is something that is completely optional to the
right. It's a nice thing if you like it.
Yeah.
I don't. So that would be, for my preference would be the more customizable I can make my slab, the happier I will be. For me personally, I would much rather have the grade be behind the book at the bottom of the slab and not up there at the top, because it would make framing them easier. So,
Yeah. It is an interesting thing for sure. Oh, there you go. Yeah, and yeah, the funniest part about all this is grading itself is and slabbing is a very contentious issue as well about whether or not people should or shouldn't grade. By the way, the thing that I always have to think of when that happens is people that are, if you go to like the comic book collecting subreddit on Reddit, anybody who posts a slab, 100% you will find at least 2 comments of saying like, free that from its plastic prison, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or I can't believe you'd slab that book. It always cracks me up because it's not permanent. You could take the book out of there. It's not like it's encaged forever and ever. So I think that if you choose to slab, and we talked about this in our episode about to slab or not to slab, don't let people shame you either way. Like if you want to slab your books, great. If you don't want to slab your books, you don't have to.
Right.
So if your Monarch says, I'm going third party moving forward, 99% of what I want slabbed is expensive covers or copies I just want protected. The grades or resale isn't my high priority. Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's totally respectable.
Yeah, I mean, and again, this is another one of those, we say this so often on this show, we're not here to yuck anybody's yum.
Yeah.
Right? You like CGC, go to CGC, who gives a damn?
Yeah.
You don't, go to CBCS, who gives a damn? You want to go to EGS or PGX or one of these other companies? Have fun. You collect you. And this whole topic started off as what's the difference between a 9.8, a 9.9, and a 10. And a lot of times the difference is the company you chose, the book you sent in, and the amount of money you're willing to spend on it.
Yep.
You might have a 9.8, but if you pay for that pressing and cleaning from that company, maybe could see a little bit higher grade. I'm gonna make them, but they can't refuse.
Yeah, exactly. It's
kind of it's all so nebulous.
Yeah.
That you, at the end of the day, have to collect the way you want to collect, how you want to collect, what you want to collect. If you care about 9.8s, then spend your time and energy searching them out. If you don't, ignore them. Doesn't matter. But at the end of the day, the important part is that you have the book you want the way you want it.
That's right. And if you're somebody who's out there and you say you want to collect 10s, hey, more power to you. I could see the novelty in that as well. That makes sense.
Right. I'm to the point now where I almost want to collect NGs.
Wow, I don't know. Is that a backhanded compliment? I don't.
Like,
you're winning them over one at a time, Kyle. Hearts and minds.
Hey, if one person likes me, that's one more person than normal. No, like I said,
that's a good point.
Right. That that is the thing that every day I come into my office and I look at my comic art and I look at my books and I look at my, my collection that I've curated and brought to the office. And I go, I can't believe my job is to do the stuff that I did for free when I was 7 years old going into a comic book shop.
Yeah.
Like, period. And at the end of the day, like, that's all this is we are here talking as adults about the things we loved as kids. And, it's this great thing we get to do. So we said we were going to cut the stream a little short today. Bronze has another stream coming up in 20 minutes.
That's right. And
so I want him to be able to get a drink of water and take a poop and not on the floor at New York Comic Con.
No, luckily New York Comic Con is safe. Don't worry, everybody.
Do all that kind of stuff so that he can have a great stream. I'll be in the comments on that.
Nice.
I just want to hit a couple of things here.
Sure.
You can protect books with over-the-counter materials, not spend $30, but some people would prefer to not do that work. Again, the thing about collecting is it's all about the amount of work you're willing to put in. If you're willing to put in the work to do it, more power to you. You're going to save a bunch of money. Other people would rather spend a little bit of money and not do the work.
Alternatively, you could spend $30 and protect it better than a slab. Just saying.
It's true. How about the people that collect just CGC Golden Age pages only? Yes.
That's cool. I didn't realize that was a thing, but it doesn't surprise me, I guess.
Yeah. No. So everybody, I'll be in the comments on Bronze's stream in like 20 minutes. You guys should be there too. We will be back next week. I think we'll just do the rest of our mailbag next week.
Yeah, sounds good.
Here on the stream. And then we will see everybody for other streams here on the Experience. I will be here with Jay tomorrow doing Minute to Skim It, which is comic book reviews. And then we have other great shows coming on throughout the week. And remember, the Lost Batman Day stream, which was never really lost. It's always been available over on Facebook, but not on YouTube because YouTube has rules I didn't know about. We'll be back in bits starting on Wednesday.
Oh, can't wait.
So check that out. We're going to start with actually an interview that Bronze himself did.
Oh, nice.
So that will be the first show up there on Wednesday from the Batman Day stream. So hit like, hit subscribe, go follow Bronze Age Nerd on YouTube and on all the social medias. Follow the Experience on all the social medias. And we will see everybody next time.
Sounds good. Have a good night, everybody.
Join the party. Head over to our link tree to find all the links for everywhere the Experience is all the time.